Hello, everyone. This is the 103rd episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle of the 1888 Letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview Dr. Peter J. Watson, a lecturer in the Department of Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies at the University of Leeds. We continue the second part of our interview with Mr. Watson as we discuss Colombian football history from 1945 into the 1962 World Cup. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Johan. It's lovely to be back on the podcast.
Thank you. So let's go back in time. Can you describe the state of the affairs with the Colombian football scene at the end of World War II?
Sure. So I guess we can look at it on two levels in terms of the kind of club football that's existing and also maybe the national team football that's existing or not existing. So really, the only time that the Colombian national team has appeared, if we start with the national team first, was in 1938. So prior to the start of World War II, there's the Bolivarian Games, which is a multi kind of sport competition. And the football competition involves Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela. Colombia come fourth, which is seen as a bit of a disaster. They only beat Venezuela. And really, after that period of time, there's no real thought of putting together a representative team. But again, this is very difficult to do so anyway, because you have a very regionalized country. Things like communication, transport has improved, but still, journeys to and from different cities and regions is rather sporadic and time consuming. What you have at a kind of a club level anyway is more of a regional set of competitions at an amateur level. So we have different leagues in the different regions or the different departments of Colombia. The strongest of these is in the Atlántico department, which is up in the North Caribbean coast, which is where Cartagena, Santa Marta, Barranquilla are. And this is where the Colombian Football Federation, ADE Football, can be found. And they are kind of seen to be the strongest of the football associations. There are obviously teams like Junior, one of the famous teams in Colombian football that still exist, are playing in that kind of regional league. But there are also regional leagues in Cundinamarca, where Bogotá is, in Antioquia, where Medellín is, in the Valle del Cauca. But the football is largely played in the regions rather than in between regions. There are occasional friendly matches between different clubs, but these are fairly rare. So there's no professional league, even though there are a few foreign players that are starting to come to the country ostensibly to teach football. There is a little bit of amateurism, if you like, this kind of under the table professionalism. But essentially, we have a kind of a period of football that is kind of characterized by regional interests only rather than national prerogatives. Now, I guess that starts to change in 1945 when Colombia invited to the 18th version of the Copa America, or the South American Championship. This is going to be held in Santiago. And again, this is the 18th time it's been played, and Colombia has never played before. So you can see that Colombia is lagging behind, at least in national terms, compared to other South American countries. Uruguay has already won the World Cup by now. They've won the Olympics twice already. Obviously, Brazil have done well. Argentina are doing well. Peru have played in the 1936 Olympics and done pretty well. So Colombia is kind of, in the category of the lesser known, in the chicos, the small ones, if you like. One of the problems with this particular tournament, in terms of showing the regional pressures that Colombia has, is that ADE Football are the people contacted. This is the Barranquilla Football Association, and they decide to send just a team that involves players from their particular region. So it's not a Colombian team, it is a team of Atlántico, of just their department. And there are lots of complaints about this. The government actually gets involved, pressurized by some of the other football associations. They know we've got to have some of the other football players. But CONMEBOL, the South American Football Federation, supports ADE Football. So this is the kind of way it is. And apparently there are attempts to try and stop the team traveling in Colombia. Apparently, they try to block their passports. So each of the players from Barranquilla, and I think there's a few from Santa Marta, have to go to ask for passports, because obviously having a passport isn't common at this point. And they have to ask for passports, but not as footballers. So they're saying, well, I'm a carpenter, I'm a bricklayer, I'm a, whatever else jobs they did. So they almost kind of travel by deceit. And in fact, there is an instruction sent to the Colombian ambassador in Chile to say, when the team gets there, you shouldn't allow them to play because they're not going to be representative of Colombia. So that gives you an idea of this regional problem. I mean, and even the journey down to Santiago is kind of fraught by a lack of preparation and a lack of organization. The journey takes them 24 days to get from Barranquilla all the way to Santiago. They fly to Cali, which is in Colombia. They then travel by road to get to Buenaventura, which is a port city. They think they can get a boat all the way down the coast to Valparaiso in Chile, but there's no boat. So then they have to kind of get this bus across the mountains from Peru. And because they thought they would be going, it'd be a lot warmer, they're all wearing kind of Caribbean clothes. So they have this terrible journey across the mountains and then the bus breaks down. So they have to get through Ecuador on foot or something like that. They get to Peru and the money's run out. So they're having to play these baseball exhibition games in Callao to kind of raise money for the rest of the journey. And again, a lot of the players played baseball as well. It was quite popular on the Caribbean coast. So they managed to earn a bit of money with these exhibition games. And it's only then when they manage to get a boat that travels down to Chile. But even that boat is a sugar boat. It's not a kind of passenger vessel. So there's two hammocks. They're forced to kind of take it in turns to sleep. So the whole journey is a disaster. And when they do get there, they're thrashed by Brazil, by Uruguay. They lose 2-0 to Chile. They lose 9-1 to Argentina. Or they do score at least the first ever goal in Copa America, scored by Arturo Guarapo Mendoza. But then they beat Ecuador. Again, then they draw with Bolivia, and then they come something like 5th out of the 7. So, but there's such a difference of where they are compared to all the big ones. The local newspaper in Barranquilla kind of portrays them as heroes. They say, we are the champions of the small teams. Whereas the rest of the kind of national newspaper saying, this was a disgrace, this isn't representative, we've gone and cast shame on ourselves.
If I may interrupt you,
yeah.
Why was there such a division between the regional leagues? How did that come about?
Well, this is very much a feature of Colombia anyway. Again, Colombia is a nation cursed by its geography, in the fact that you have mountains, you have jungles, you have plains, it was very difficult to build the transport infrastructure the country needed. So, you don't have these regular journeys. The flying is obviously quite rare. It's very expensive. Certainly, it's far too expensive for amateur football teams to afford to maybe fly to Barranquilla from Cali or from Bogota. These things have to be organized. So you don't have really what we consider to be a central football federation. It doesn't exist really in Colombia. ADE Football is a Barranquilla organization that represents the Caribbean coast, and that was the first one that got FIFA recognition. But this is very much the same across the whole of the country. You have quite there are periods of centralization in government and kind of decentralization, but each region in Colombia has very specific identities, very specific characteristics. And a lot of Colombian at this particular time would say, well, I feel more from Atlantic, or I feel more from the Valle del Cauca, or I feel more from Cundinamarca or Antioquia than I do Colombian. So that's really the reason why you have this sense of a kind of a lack of unity or a lack of representativity in Colombian football at this time.
We come to the pivotal season of 1948 that would lead to the somewhat of an increase in the standards. Can you get into that?
Yeah, so this is also after another failed Copa America. There's a 1947 one where again, it's again really a team that's sent from Atlantico. It has again even less success. They only draw with Bolivia and Ecuador. There's a little bit of shame as well. Some of the players are seen as being drunk in Ecuador where the tournament's being held. The only thing that does go well is that there's a goalkeeper called Efrain Cayman Sanchez who kind of saves lots of shots in his general direction. Is actually signed by San Lorenzo, the Argentinian giants. But I think what has happened is that these national tournaments have created interest in the potential for representative football. And they're seeing, Colombians are seeing how far behind they are compared to the likes of Peru, Argentina, Uruguay, and so on. And what you start to get are entrepreneurs who see the potential of football as a professional sport because it's still very amateur. And they also see the potential of it being of trying to create a national league to replicate, what's going on in Uruguay and Argentina, albeit they've got very much city-based, in lots of ways the leagues there are quite Buenos Aires-based or Montevideo-based. But they see the need for a national professional football competition. And again, there are lots of debates about this. There is this kind of underground or under the table professionalism already going on. So they see the need to maybe rectify this, and they see the chance to make money, really. So there are people like Humberto Salcedo Fernandez, who is an entrepreneur. We have Alfonso Senior, who again is one of the leading figures. And they create this organization called Di Mayor with the idea to create a professional league. Now, this is kind of rushed into operation when in 1948, in April, the liberal politician Jorge Eliezer Gaitan is assassinated by a rogue kind of political dissident, probably a conservative supporter. And there's huge amounts of political tensions in Colombia. There's been a history of warfare between liberals and conservatives. And this is kind of like the spark of conflict. We have an absolute conflagration in Bogota where the assassination is carried out. It's called the Bogotazo because of the sheer violence that it kind of unleashes. And the violence spreads around the country. We have a kind of period of murder and counter-murder between liberal supporters and conservative supporters. And so the government is looking around for a way of pacifying tension. So it supports this professional football project idea. And so it's kind of rushed into operation in August 1948. We have the first professional league that starts. The first league includes 10 teams. We have 2 teams from Cali. We have 2 teams from Medellin. We have 2 from Bogota. We have 2 from Manizales. We have 1 team from Barranquilla. And we have another team called Universidad, who are from Bogota, but actually are supposed to play their games in Pereira. So it's by no means a full national league. A lot of the country is not represented, but it's the first start anyway. And it emerges basically as a case of saying, let's try and have entertainment, let's try and have football, and let's try to pacify tensions. These entrepreneurs had seen that when touring teams had come to Colombia, that there was an audience for this. They thought there is money to be made here. So there's 2 kind of processes or 3 processes going on to try and get better at football, to reduce the violence, and to try and make some money. The very first game is played, I think it's on the 15th of August. It's between Municipal and Universidad. It's actually played at a stadium which is a horse racing course in Itagüí near Medellin. It's not even a proper football pitch. The first goal is scored by Rafael Serna, and it only merits 2 paragraphs in one of the major kind of current affairs newspapers. But gradually it gets more and more attention, gradually gets more and more success. The crowds start to grow. And at the end of this first season, we see the first footballers appearing on the front covers of Semana, the magazine that previously only covered it with 2 paragraphs. Santa Fe are champions, and we can start to see a real interest and profit being made in Colombian football.
Yes, and the first 4 players, I imagine they would have all been from Argentina or Uruguay.
Yeah, there's a few. There's a few already in that first league. I think there's something like 29, something like that. The leading scorers are both Argentinian. Actually, there's a guy called name's Canon at Santa Fe. There's another one called Pedro Castillon I think it's Castillon at Millonarios. So there are a few around. There's also an interesting figure called Fernando Paternoster, who was a member of the 1930 Argentine World Cup team, and he's gone to Colombia to coach. So there has been an effort to attract some of these, some players to come and teach football or to coach football or to help us understand. And there's always this link with Argentina as being the people who can coach us, who can teach us how to play. To the extent where you have almost like this father-son relationship. Argentina sees itself as they're the fathers of Colombian football in a way, because they went to teach these benighted Colombians who didn't know how to do it and were just chicos and had no idea what technique was or team play was. So that's the kind of relationship. There's a few other foreign players sprinkled around. There's a couple actually from Costa Rica who've come south to play in this league. But the kind of huge influx of foreign players won't really start until the 1949 season.
Yes, as you mentioned, this 1949 season we see even bigger and bigger stars arriving to Colombia, Alfredo Di Stefano among them. Can you describe what led to this influx of top stars to Colombia?
Yeah, so it's really a chance to make profit. There is the idea that money is to be made, and really there's a sense of opportunism that goes on. The two kind of defining features really are the fact that there are strikes in both Uruguayan and Argentinian football from the players who are upset about their wages, about contract situations and things like that. So there's discontent in Argentina and Uruguay. And the other kind of aspect is that you have one of the entrepreneurs of the Millonarios club, one of the Bogota clubs, Alfonso Senior, who sends his kind of coach Carlos Cacho Aldave to Argentina and said, look, find the best player you can. Here's a certain amount of money. Come back with the best player you can, and we'll see if this will stimulate not only our team but the public to come and watch Millonarios. So there is a kind of visionary element to this. So Cacho Aldave goes down to Buenos Aires, and he comes back with Adolfo Pedernera. And Pedernera is a huge figure. You know, he is one of the great Máquina team of River Plate. You know, that phenomenal team of the 1940s. And when he comes to Colombia, this causes an absolute national sensation. Semana, again, the magazine that I was referring to previously, described that there are a huge amount of crowds at the airport. Apparently, a small boy bites Pedernera to see if he's real. And there's a description of the country suffering suddenly from pedernitis, this kind of made-up illness of kind of contagion that Pedernera's signing has caused. There is a sign up in a kind of a supermarket or a warehouse that says that people are not allowed to discuss football and Pedernera during working hours. So this is the kind of extent of it. And again, the Millonarios board, when they find out about the signing, they think, no, there's no way we can afford this. And Senior says, well, look, I will pay him myself if it goes wrong. Pedernera does not play in the first game, but the crowd is so big that the money they spent to kind of contract him already has been paid back. And it's important to remember that they haven't officially signed him from River Plate. There is from these actually called Acand or Atlanta at the time. There is a players' strike, so they've kind of gone behind the backs of the clubs to sign Pedernera. The game he does play, you know, the first game he plays is a huge success. Again, the crowds are all there. And this is the starting point. People suddenly realize that stars will attract crowds. A couple of months later, given the success of bringing Pedernera, Millonarios send Pedernera back to Buenos Aires. And he comes back with Alfredo Di Stefano, who at this point hasn't established himself as the star that we all know him to be. But he is basically one of the greatest young talents in Argentinian football. And he also comes back with Nestor Rossi, again, one of the great kind of midfielders, stroke kind of defensive midfielders of this particular generation. So this kicks it off. This kind of excitement of the Millonarios team starts it. And other teams start to follow suit. So you kind of get this arms race of we need to compete with these great stars, but equally we're bringing stars to entertain, to be, you know, public figures, to bring in the crowds. So we have, for example, Deportivo Cali go out and buy they kind of pirate some of the best players of the Peru 1940s team. So we get Valeriano Lopez, we get Drago, we get Barbadillo. Lopez is known as the Tanque de Casma, the tank of Casma. He's one of the best kind of headers of the football that's been seen in South America. He's one of the few footballers that scored more goals than games played. I think Cúcuta go out and try to buy Uruguayans. Santa Fe are buying a combination of Paraguayans and Argentinians. So there's kind of arms race of trying to get foreign footballers in, to get the crowds to raise the level. The problem is, of course, with this is that Colombian footballers themselves are kind of disappearing by the margins. You know, they're not good enough to compete with this level. They're not seen as being entertaining, not seen as being interesting. And this is what we kind of get, a very early version of, I guess, you know, the Premier League in Britain as it is now, really.
Now, when they were signing all these players, were they already breaking the FIFA rules, or was that something separate?
Yeah, no, they're breaking the rules by now. So what has happened by now is that we have a kind of conflict between ADE Football, which is still the amateur football association that is affiliated to FIFA, and D Mayor, which is the organizer of the professional league, which is not. So there is a rupture. ADE Football kind of protests to FIFA. FIFA decide to disaffiliate Di Mayor. So they're effectively working outside the organized professional system. So kind of player contracts and club contracts don't apply to them. So they're effectively committing piracy. And again, the Colombian league is seen as being a pirate league from this particular time, after Pedernera, after Rossi, Di Stefano, and all the other players. And we get the Argentinian league started off complaining to FIFA and complaining about Colombian processes to help this process happen. But actually, all it does is, because they make it more of a pirate league, they can just carry on doing what they want. There's no pressure
So
on them.
I imagine FIFA did not have much of a leverage, because in any case, Colombia were not that involved internationally anyway. Is that the reason, perhaps? Yeah.
This is absolutely it. So Colombia don't really feel the pressure. I mean, in 1949, there is another Copa America, to give you an idea. ADE Football insists that Junior, who have been playing in the professional league, pull out of it to represent Colombia in that particular 1949 trophy. So again, we don't have the few Colombian players that are playing in the professional league are not playing. It's the junior team. So once again, ADE Football are almost running the Colombian national team as it's supposed to be, but just as a regional team. And again, once again, the 1949 team fails, which again, in the Colombian eyes, discredits ADE Football. And then the public are kind of more supporting this professional initiative, seeing that it's being much more successful, it's much more entertaining. And there's a kind of an idea or a hope in the press is that even though there are so many players playing, so many foreign players playing in this league, the idea is that hopefully they will be teaching the Colombian players how to play. They'll be, used to kind of develop the game. And so eventually this kind of period of pirate football will eventually reap the benefits in the longer term.
Now, this era has been known to be El Dorado. How did that term come about?
It's difficult. I haven't been able to quite pinpoint exactly when it starts to be used. I've certainly seen it starting to be used in 1949 and 1950 in some of the sports newspapers at the time. Again, it goes back to the old conquistadores legend of the Golden One, this idea of somewhere there was a lake or a tribe, with lots of gold, and there was so it's kind of going back to these mythological times. One of the reasons it's called that is that many footballers in South America, and indeed, eventually in Europe as well, start seeing it as a chance for riches. They're getting paid a lot more than they were being paid in their own countries. The contracts, obviously in Uruguay and Argentina, were the things that a lot of players were protesting about. Indeed, Neil Franklin, the England player who will join the league in 1950, is another person who has protested and complained about the wages he was getting at Stoke City in the English league.
The Bogota Bandit, as he became known.
Absolutely, There's Charlie Mitten and there's George Mountford, and they're all attracted by the chance to earn more money. So, I mean, this does lead to problems in the fact that a lot of the players are reported to lead a rather bohemian lifestyle. There are numerous stories of carousing and of drinking and womanizing. Valeriano Lopez apparently would occasionally light a cigar with dollar bills, apparently, by all accounts. So, so this is a period of kind of of excess. And I think that one of the other ideas that comes out about this golden glittering period is that it's not very substantial. The players that are coming are trying to show off. There's very little ethos of team play, of good coaching. They're coming to live the life, to play football for fun, to give it a spectacle. And I guess this is one of the things that has largely been most criticized by academics and historians about this period, the El Dorado League, is that there is a lot of style, there is a lot of talent, there is a lot of spectacle. But behind it all, it's not really building any permanent blocks that will be very useful for Colombian football in the longer term.
But however, the popularity of this league would grow further in the new decade of the 1950s. What were the significant changes around this time?
So the most important things really is that we see the league reach its peak in terms of teams that are participating. There is a lot of interest in developing the league away from the first 6 cities which are included. By 1950, we get 16 teams playing. We have the additions of football being played in cities like Cucuta. We have another Cali team, Boca Juniors, not the Boca Juniors, but a team inspired by them. Bucaramanga have joined the year before. There's another Medellin team called Huracan, again inspired by the Argentinian name. Junior are back in the league again after their failed 1949 exploits in the Copa America. We have another team from Barranquilla called Sporting. A team from Pereira has joined as well. So this is the first thing that we see. We see a kind of growth of teams coming to play. What doesn't change is that there is a tendency to contract more and more foreign players. Again, the reach is growing, though. We see a Lithuanian, for example, who is the goalkeeper at Portes Caldas, who will rather surprisingly win the league. We start to get the British players turning up. There are some other great names that come. There's a very controversial figure called Heleno de Freitas, who is a great Brazilian player, almost more famous for his exploits off the pitch in the nightclubs than on it. In fact, De Freitas, who Gabriel Garcia Marquez remembers playing, there's a lovely newspaper report by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the great Colombian author, who remembers Heleno de Freitas. That's a very nice description of him. But De Freitas actually tries to flee Junior. He asks for a kind of advance of his contract, which has been frittering away on prostitutes and alcohol and goodness knows what else. And De Freitas tries to run away with the money, and he's actually captured before he gets on the plane and made to pay up. So there's lots of stories about him.
Yeah.
And
there's a film about his life, I believe, right?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, I've forgotten the name of the actor who plays him.
Was it Rodrigo Santoro? I don't remember.
That's
exactly.
right, Rodrigo Santoro. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, I think it's available on YouTube for those who might be interested in watching it. I think it's just called Heleno. Yeah. But yeah.
In the North American Soccer League in the 70s, perhaps unjustly got a reputation where it was a league where let's say British or foreign players would go to make a quick buck, maybe towards the tail end of their career. Are there parallels with that and this league, you think?
I think it's a good comparison. I think that certainly the El Dorado is the first time really where we are looking at a mass throwing money for spectacle, trying to get the best players we possibly can. We've seen it happen several times since. The American League you talk about is certainly one. You could say that the Chinese League is certainly another. What's happening in Saudi Arabia over the last 12 months is another example of this. So I think that it's not just old players, though. We have players at the peak of their powers. De Stefano is a young player. Pedernera certainly was towards the end of his career, but Nestor Rossi had a lot of life left in him. All the Peruvian players that came were at the peak of their powers. Some of the Uruguayans as well, who won the 1950 World Cup. A number of them turn up in Colombia after that. Neil Franklin is expected to be in the 1950 England World Cup squad. So the same, maybe Charlie Mitten, maybe not at that level, but George Mountford. These are all players with their careers in front of them. So this, what you also get, actually, there's a few more like Hector Real, who will go on to play in Spain. René Pontoni are players that, are developing their careers. So it's not just let's find the big names of the past. It's let's pick the biggest names in the continent at the moment. The Brazilian names don't really come. Some of the great Argentinians also don't come. I know particularly the players at Racing are protected by Perón's finance minister, Ramon Cerejo, who is not keen at all to let his his best players leave. So, you also get a few kind of, some of the foreign players get contracts to their mates, though. So there are players who aren't very good that can't make a fast buck. Suddenly the clubs realize they're not good enough and they're kind of discarded again. So there's a little bit of everything.
During the 1934 World Cup, Argentina famously sent a B team over to Italy so that its best players would not be poached by Italian clubs. Was there something similar, like you mentioned about Racing? Was there something similar with Argentina as to
Definitely.
kind of block players from going there?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, once they realized what was going on, we've already said that the Argentinian FA, complained to FIFA. They start to put more controls on their players. There's a great story about actually Real and René Pontoni, who have to be smuggled out of the country I'm trying to remember exactly the details. I think they have to go to a kind of rural airport outside of the capital and then are smuggled across the border to Uruguay and then are flown up to Colombia. So there's a lot of subterfuge involved. These clubs in Argentina are losing their best players, and these are contracted players. These are players that they think they have under contract. They're paying their wages, and then suddenly, without any due process, they're being effectively pirated away. So, I mean, Argentina are the main movers in what will eventually lead to the end of the El Dorado. But certainly the other clubs in Uruguay and Peru are also very worried about this kind of talent, this kind of vacuum, this kind of escaping, and much like it happened with the Oriundi or the Rimpatriati in the 1930s, where, Italy are looking for all of the best Argentinian players who have Italian fathers or parents, and then saying, well, you can play for us now. And several of them do in the 1934 World Cup, as you know. So there is an attempt to try and protect their footballing assets, yes.
Due to the presence of perhaps Di Stefano, this 1950s era really benefited Millonarios. Can you just go into the growth and the popularity of the game at this early stage of the 50s?
Yeah, so really Millonarios are the team that dominates the El Dorado period. They were the ones that brought Pedernera in the first place. Obviously, Di Stefano. We have Nestor Rossi as well. There's Raul Pini, who is a great Uruguayan centre-back. And the team that is created in Millonarios is, they win the league in 1949, in 51, in 52, in 53. And this team comes known as the Blue Ballet. This is probably the team that best finds a way to combine the talents to create not just an attacking individualistic spectacle, but also a team that will play as a team. Because they're also in the capital, which is where most of the sporting press and national press is, they are obviously heralded as being the forerunners, the greats of this particular league. One of the things they're famous for is the cinco y baile, the five and dance, is that they will score 5 goals and then they're not allowed to score anymore. They will just kind of have fun after the 5th goal. So there are lots of instances of seeing them scoring 5 goals in a row. And there's actually one where they score a 6th goal. And I think it's a guy called Soria, who I think is Peruvian from memory, who realizes that he can win a very nice hat if he scores a 6th goal. So he scores and then gets roundly criticized by the rest of his teammates for breaking this ethos. But Millonarios, again, become the pride of Colombia in many ways as well, because the fame of what they're achieving spreads internationally. They become famous for the quality of their team in South America. It goes beyond Colombia, but also to Europe. And Real Madrid will invite them to play in a tournament that commemorates their 50th anniversary in 1952. And it's not a massive tournament. They play, there's 4 teams. There's Real Madrid, there's Sevilla, and there's the Swedish team, Norrköping, I think it's pronounced, plus Millonarios. And Millonarios beat Real Madrid 4-2. They actually draw with the other 2 games. But this win against one of the great names of European and Spanish football, and again, this is before the European Cup triumphs of that great Real Madrid side, but they still have this renown. And again, it's seen as the first time a Colombian team has gone to Europe. It's the first time they've won. They've beaten one of the great teams. So suddenly this not just reflects on Millonarios, but reflects on Colombia as well. And in fact, the ambassador to Spain, Guillermo Valencia, who will go on to be the Colombian president, said that this is the greatest kind of diplomatic achievement that Colombia has ever achieved. It goes far beyond what he's achieved. So suddenly, and again, there's been a book recently written, actually published in Colombia, about how Millonarios, in the eyes of Colombians anyway, had suddenly become the best team of the world. So it's the first real time that football becomes a source of national pride. Obviously, the Copa America teams represented by the country, i.e., that just the Atlantic or region players, had really failed. So suddenly, it's a Colombian team beating the best team in Europe. Actually, Real Madrid will come to Colombia in the following year and be beaten again twice. So it's not just a one-off. They've beaten 3 times in 3 occasions. The one problem with this, of course, is that there are only 2 Colombian players in this Millonarios squad. There is the reserve goalkeeper, and then there is a guy called Francisco Cobo Zuluaga, who is one of the kind of major defenders, one of the better Colombian players in the league at this time. There are a precious few of those.
In a way, we should say that this is a sliding doors moment for the history of Real Madrid, that friendly tournament, in a way.
Yeah, without doubt. I mean, that's the site of Di Stefano. Yeah.
Yeah. The departure of, like you said, I guess the discovery and departure of Alfredo Di Stefano in 1953 is, in a way, the reference point when the league kind of breaks down. So,
yeah.
What was the state of the football in the nation for the rest of the decades following that?
So I think Di Stefano is kind of seen as the final moment of glory in lots of ways, but the writing was already on the wall because of the complaints of the South American teams, but some of the European teams as well, about the fact that this footballing piracy couldn't go on. There had been a Pact of Lima in 1951, which agreed that the players could stay at the Colombian clubs for another 3 years before they would return to their previous teams and, regain their previous contracts. So already there is the idea that these players are going to go. And with that starting to happen, the players are starting to move away. There is also, I think, an economic collapse in that a lot of the clubs, a lot of the cities have spent too much money bringing these players in. Not all of them have had success. Obviously, the clubs that are not winning are starting to falter. In 1952, we start to see some of the clubs starting to disappear. By 1953, another 5 teams have gone. One of the great stories actually of that particular generation is a team called Samarios, which is a team that played in Magdalena. There had been a team of Hungarian exiles who had been formed to tour South America. And they travel through Colombia, they get to Ecuador, but then the kind of tour breaks down and they're forced to return to Colombia. And so this particular team of great Hungarians who are kind of fled the end of the Second World War are suddenly stuck in Colombia, and they end up joining the league. The Samarios team of Hungarians will join the league, and one of them is Sengelev, who had played in I think it's the 1938 World Cup, 1934 World Cup for Hungary, and had been one of the great players of that generation. So you have these unusual events of kind of touring teams that suddenly become a team and join the league, but it's very unsustainable. So we have, Samarios will lose a lot of their Hungarian players, will revert to be calling Magdalena. America de Cali leave the league. Universidad, after struggling for many years, fall apart. To the extent that by 1954, the year after Di Stefano has gone, there's only 10 teams left. And this is a sign of the fact that the crowds have kind of lost interest. The money has fallen out of the game. And it's not really left much there. There are only a couple of teams that really try to do something different than buy foreign players. And one of them is originally called Municipal. They would then change their name to Atlético Nacional, which is what their name is now. And they have an only native players policy. So they're the one team that look ahead and say, well, let's back our own talents. Let's ignore what every other club is doing. And it's no surprise, really, that because of that, they win the league after, the 1954 version of the league, which is when all the stars have gone. But Di Stefano, going back to that one, is the really pivotal moment. He is the kind of star of the league that's been the top scorer for several seasons. And again, Sid Lowe, in his book about the rivalry between Real Madrid and Barcelona, talks about that in a lot of detail. I think it takes him 2 chapters to explain it all, about how Barcelona tried to have an agreement with Millonarios to sign him, but Real Madrid have approached River Plate for the signing. So there's a tug of war over Alfredo Di Stefano. But really, when he goes, there's very little star quality left. The players that are still there are very much second or third rate foreign players in the most part. And this kind of means that the league loses its luster. There is one kind of final big signing, though, that happens in 1955, which is the great José Charro Moreno, again seen as one of the greatest ever Argentinian and South American players of his time. Again, another member of that La Máquina team of River Plate. He joins Deportivo Independiente Medellín right at the end of his career. He's already played in Mexico. He's played in Chile as well. And in Colombia's where he finishes. And he inspires them. I think he's in his 40s at this point, or very late 30s. He inspires Medellin to win that league. So just his star quality and just his presence is enough to be better than the kind of slightly ropey, mostly native owned or kind of second or third rate foreigners teams that are left in the kind of aftermath of El Dorado.
They're still participating in the Copa America at this point, but I imagine the results are still disappointing.
Well, they're not actually, yeah, because FIFA have banned them. They don't participate in the early 50s in the first versions that are there. So it's not until 1957 where we see Colombia once again being allowed to play in the Copa America. They hadn't played in 53, they hadn't played in 55. In 57, they come fourth. There's only 6 teams there. They do better than Chile, which is a success. You know, Chile have got slightly more heritage. They beat Ecuador, who again are another team that have struggled to really put out a representative national side. We have a big rivalry in Ecuador between the teams of Guayaquil and the teams of Quito. And again, it's a really interesting tournament, that one. Again, there are still arguments going on between AD Football and Di Mayor. There is always this battle for power over Colombian football. Originally, AD Football want to send the Valle del Cauca. This is the team around Cali, but they want to send an amateur team. And this team is coached by one of these kind of really incredible figures who deserves a book about him. Is a Hungarian called György Orth. And he had been a footballer for Hungary. He played a lot of games for Budapest. I think he'd scored 13 goals as an attacking midfielder for one of the great Hungary sides in the 1930s. But he kind of goes on this kind of globe-trotting coaching career. He'd been in Chile, in Colo-Colo. He'd been coaching Italy, then Germany. He goes to France. He goes to Italy, then goes to Chile with Magallanes, and then he coaches at San Lorenzo and Rosario Central in Argentina. He coaches some teams in Mexico, back to Argentina, back to Chile, and then finally Colombia. So in 1957, he almost coaches Colombia in the Copa America. It's a remarkable story. He ends up coaching in Porto before he dies in 1962. So there must be a great book someone's got to write about him. But again, this Colombian 1957 team, it starts off just being an amateur team, but then a few of the better professional players are included. Cobo Zuluaga still around, a great Millonarios defender. Cayman Sanchez, who had played in that 1947 Copa America team as the goalkeeper, is still around. He's plays as well. It doesn't really help them. They lose the first game 8-2 to Argentina. This is a team that includes Omar Sivori, Corbata, again, 2 of the great kind of figures of that particular 1950s Argentinian generation. But that team is mostly amateurs. You know, that's a team where they play the amateurs. Then a few of the pros are put in the next couple of games. Although they lose 9-0 to Brazil, another disaster, they actually beat Uruguay. So that is really the first time that the national team has an epic success, beating, you know, World Cup winners 7 years previously, Uruguay. And that goal is scored by Carlos Arango. Again, it's not a great success, but at least there is that kind of one moment. We can try and forget the 8-2 loss in Argentina, the 9-0 loss to Brazil, but at least they beat Uruguay in that moment.
So we come to the 1962 World Cup qualification, and Colombia are managed by Adolfo Pedernera. Was this qualification success a direct byproduct of the El Dorado era, or is it completely unrelated?
It's difficult to know. It's a difficult one to say because obviously quite a bit of time has gone on. Not many of the players that are playing in that 1962 World Cup actually played in the El Dorado period with all the foreign players. Cayman Sanchez certainly did. Cobo Zuluaga certainly did. But they're really 2, I think, of this squad. I think only 2 really appeared. I suppose what you could say is that what that El Dorado did is inspire at least a widespread awareness of football and excitement about football, and maybe a sense of, I want to be like Di Stefano, I want to be like Pedernera, I want to be like Heledo de Freitas or Valeriano Lopez or Neil Franklin, whoever else. So maybe some of the players who are playing in 1962 would have been quite young. maybe would have been inspired by reading and hearing on the radio these great players. So maybe to that extent, we could see that as a potentially direct byproduct. But a lot of writers at the time in the 1940s and 1950s, at the time of El Dorado, said that everything was being improvised. There was no attempt to build a structure or a youth structure or coach young players or learn from these great players. That wasn't something that was happening. So if it was a direct product, it's almost by accident, just because of inspiration, rather than any deliberate structures that had been put in place to make it happen.
Yeah, and also in 1962, Brazil were the defending World Cup champions and Chile were the hosts. So perhaps their path to qualification was somewhat easier. I mean, all they had to do was just to defeat Peru and they were through.
That's it. Yeah. I mean, they were supposed to be in a group with Bolivia as well, but Bolivia pulled out. I mean, it's one of the things that they say is that whoever was going to win from Peru and Colombia was going to go into the group in Arica for the Chile World Cup. Now, Arica is basically right in the very far north of Chile. It actually used to be in Peru. So there was the assumption that Peru would qualify, that Peruvian fans would be able to come to Arica to watch Peru play. It would be a success. So in some ways, it was a shock to everyone that Colombia managed to beat Peru in the kind of two-leg game. And I mean, again, even in Colombia, there was a shock about it. You know, everyone thought that Peru would win. They didn't actually have a coach a month before the qualifiers against Peru. It wasn't like Pedernera had been there, you know, for a couple of years working away with the national team. The team wasn't together. You know, they didn't, you know, it was such a dispersed country that they didn't train together. It was, you know, there was a kind of like an appointment process where Pedernera was eventually appointed just a month before. So it was really a kind of improvisation once again. And the one things that they did have, I mean, by now a guy called Delio Gamboa, who was known as Maravilla, the Wonder, had played in Mexico, one of the first Colombian players, certainly after Caimán Sanchez, to feature abroad. And there was a generation of some talented players. There was Héctor Zipa González, who was doing well in the Colombian league. Eusebio Escobar had been, as a forward, had scored a few goals over several seasons. And indeed, the Eusebio Escobar scores the goal in Bogotá that wins the home leg. After 2 minutes in the away leg, Peru score a penalty. But then 24 minutes later, Zipa González equalised. And that's enough. You know, they actually miss a penalty in the second half. But, you know, this was a major moment. The president, Lleras Camargo, gives all of the players 1,000 pesos as a reward for qualifying. Pedernera gets 20,000 pesos. So you can see the difference in value of the coach and the players at that point.
Let's look at this 1962 World Cup in Chile. For their first match on May 30th, they lose to Uruguay 2-1. Their next match is against the Soviet Union that ends up in the crazy score of 4-4. And remember Cole's goal direct from a corner, I guess an Olympic goal as it's called.
Yeah. Yeah.
And finally, in their last match is against Yugoslavia. They lose heavily this one, 0-5, and they're out. But I guess the takeaway is really that this was their first participation in a World Cup.
This is it. And they are rank outsiders. You know, we still, in South American terms, Colombia are the Cinderellas. You know, they are one of the small, they're still the chicos. They can't compete really with Uruguay or Brazil. You know, I mean, like 4 or 5 years before this, they've lost 8-2 and 9-0. So, you know, there is no real expectation. In actual fact, the Colombian newspapers, well, one of the magazines called Afición, at one point says we shouldn't go. You know, we're not good enough. The way we're training, the way we're preparing is not good enough. It takes quite a long time for them to have, you know, the kind of concentración, the concentration that a lot of teams have to bring them together. And when they do, it's not at a football facility. It's the training in Bogotá is held at the cavalry school in Usaquén. It's at a military facility. And they're there for 3 months eventually. So they are there for quite a long time. There's no hot water. They have to get up at 6. You know, they're not very happy, the players. And the teams that they're playing, you know, the warm-up games before the World Cup, They're playing. They win a couple. They beat Alajuela, Costa Rican team 3-1, but they also lose 2-3. They lose 2-1 to a regional team from the Atlantico region. They play two games against Mexico. They lose one and they draw the other. They lose to Bangor, a Brazilian team on tour. They do beat Karlsruhe, one of the German teams who are on tour in South America. So they're not exactly warming up very well. And there's a point where the press saying there is no way we should go. We don't want to be humiliated here. We're gonna be a laughing stock. Pedernera actually resigns or offers his resignation during this kind of run of friendlies, but the football board refuse. The one good thing that does happen really is that by now Colombia have managed to put together a national team. The players in the squad represent 9 clubs, so we don't have this amateur prevailing. We've managed to get to a point where professional players are playing, but equally there is no expectation of success, and there's not like this same kind of level of the nation stops when the country is playing football. I mean, there's a very famous quote that Cayman Sanchez, the experienced goalkeeper, was still there. He's the goalkeeper for 1962. He says that when they were leaving, the president of Colombia, Lleras Camargo, says, good luck, guys, and I hope you score a lot of baskets. It's not even goals. The president doesn't even know. So this is the level that are expected. So, there is a little bit of sponsorship. Apparently, Antonio Rada says, I was paid 400 pesos to do a toothpaste advert, and someone else was advertising, a beer thing. But they're not expected to do well. So the fact that they only lose 2-1 to Uruguay is seen as a huge achievement, and the headlines reflect that. They're winning at 1-0 at half time. Cobos Zuluaga scores a penalty. So suddenly we have this at half time in that game. It looks like the same thing that happened in 1957 might happen again. And it's only because apparently the Uruguayan players become very violent and very committed in the second half that actually they end up winning. So Cobo Zuluaga, who is the centre-back, has 2 or 3, depending on the story you read, 2 or 3 ribs broken and can't play anymore. Also, Delio Gamboa, the fulcrum of the forward line, is also injured. He has his ankle, can't remember if it's broken or very badly injured. And again, there are no substitutes allowed. So basically, Colombia are playing against 9 men in this game. So it was seen as being quite a heroic achievement. The USSR game is even more of a success. I mean, that really is a legendary result in Colombian football, probably until 1990, the greatest result in Colombian football history. And it's got all the kind of attributes of the great kind of David versus Goliath. You have the USSR team with Lev Yashin. They've won the European Championships. This is the height of the Cold War, so there's kind of fearsome machine. There are all these stories about them being military trained and huge and massive and powerful, and that they're going to squash Colombia completely. There's all this fear, but then and after 12 minutes, Colombia are losing 3-0, so it looks like it's going to be a whitewash. However, then Germán Aceros manages to score, and it's 3-1 at half time. And then we have this probably apocryphal story about Pedernera telling the lads in the changing room, who all look very scared and very nervous, and obviously they've been overawed by this USSR team. He says, right, let's sing the national anthem. So apparently the lads, the Colombian guys sing the national anthem, and they come out with renewed hope. They go 4-1 down. But then we have this Olympic goal by Mario Cole, the first ever goal in the World Cup for men anyway. I think there's been another one since by women, if I'm not mistaken. It's a terrible goal, by the way, but it is one of the most famous goals that a lot of Colombians will know because it's been shown a lot on Colombian TV. But, he mishits it. It kind of bounces 2 or 3 times before it gets to the near post. The defender inexplicably leaves it. Lev Yashin leaves it as well, and it trickles in. I mean, actually, Lev Yashin in this game has an absolute shocker. We all know Lev Yashin is apparently one of the great goalkeepers of all time, but the 4th goal is really his fault as well. He is very half-hearted when he comes out, and Marino Klinger will beat him in a 50-50 and will score into the empty net. There's been another goal as well by Antonio Rada since then, so it becomes 4-4. And this is seen by all of the Colombians as a victory. The newspapers call it a victory, even though it's a draw. There is a cartoon of the Colombian president with the Russian president, and the Colombian president saying, I'm really sorry, Nikita, but not even in football can the USSR cope against Colombia. And one of the things that's really important about this time is that there is a lot of fear about communism in South America and in Colombia particularly. It's 3 years after the Cuban Revolution, and there is a lot of fears around Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, various other parts of Central America, that there will be a kind of communist revolution in the same style as Cuba. So part of what's going on is with the kind of the political coverage of this is saying, look at what little Colombia could do about against possibly the forces of communism. It becomes a political victory, even though it's a draw. The future president says the same thing. This is a victory of democracy over totalitarianism. It's one of the great moments. It's still extolled as being, where Colombian football as a national team hits the global stage with success. The 5-0 loss against Yugoslavia doesn't really matter. It's seen as everyone, they can't raise their level again. The Yugoslavs will end up coming fourth in the tournament, so they're seen as being a very good team. A lot of that team actually will end up coaching Colombia in the future. Popovic and Sekularac will end up coaching Colombia because they remember how good that Yugoslavian team. So they're welcomed as heroes. There is a kind of a bus trip back to a hotel reception. There are thousands of Colombians on the street celebrating it. So even though, they concede, five goals against Yugoslavia, they're beaten by Uruguay, it's seen as being a remarkable success given what they feared might have happened.
Following this 1962 World Cup, at international level, Colombia was virtually non-existent for like 25 years until the 1987 Copa America with the emergence of Carlos Valderrama generation. What were the reasons, you think, for the stagnation?
It's difficult to know, really. Again, I think that in many ways, if we go back to the reason why they're there, it was still luck more than anything else. This wasn't a team that really was good enough. They were lucky to beat Peru. They did beat Peru, but it wasn't one of the better Peruvian teams. So in lots of ways, the quality of football that was being played in the country wasn't really good enough. It wasn't at that level. I think what you also have to say is that qualifying for the World Cup from South America is the hardest in the world. Almost always the groups were kind of 3 or maybe 4 team groups, depending on who happened to have won the previous World Cup. So Colombia, to qualify, would almost always be playing against someone like Brazil or Uruguay or Argentina, one of the big teams. And maybe then they'd be fighting against, I don't know, maybe Ecuador or maybe Peru or Bolivia or Chile. But Colombia are not at the same level of these greats. We don't have the same amount of teams that were qualifying for 1966 and for 1970. So this is part of the problem. They're up against it. There is still not a lot of money in Colombian football. What Colombia does do a little bit is try to be inspired by foreign schools. We do have a kind of a Yugoslav school of football coaches that are trying to improve football. We have Argentinian coaches. There is a process of sometimes naturalizing foreign players to play for the national team. But because of the nature of the competitiveness of the tournaments, there is still really a struggle to qualify. And again, I think we have a continuation of regional disputes, of board problems as well, which never helps the situation.
In closing, is this 1962 World Cup participation considered a reference point in the history of Colombian football, or like you said, there's a feeling that they were just lucky to be there?
Oh, it's definitely a reference point. This is the first great triumph of Colombian sport as a national team anyway. We haven't had any great Colombians at the Olympics. There's been no performances of note in the Copa America. So just being able to hold the USSR to a 4-4 draw is seen as being, it's an hito nacional, it's a national triumph. It's a great victory. And again, these memories matter. The Marcos Cole goal is something that, most World Cups is replayed and replayed. There was a kind of 50th anniversary celebration of the goal, in 2012. Sadly, Cole died a couple of years ago, but this goal was historic. And again, some of the players of that particular team, Delio Gamboa, Cobo Zuluaga, Marino Klinger, Antonio Rada, became heroes for that particular generation. And I guess that given the lack of other successful memories in the 20 years since then, we do have a runners-up in 1975 in the Copa America, but these players, were remembered. They went down as the time when we did do well, when we played one of the best teams in the world and we could draw with them. And again, I think what's disappointing for Colombia really until 1993 is that they don't have a great victory that serves as a national memory, as a national triumph. Even the 1990 World Cup, when they first get back to the World Cup after 28 years, the main memory of that particular tournament is drawing 1-1 against West Germany and the famous goal in the very last minute by Freddy Rincon through Bodoeña's legs. But that's a draw. It's not a win. Then you have the horrible memory of René Higuita and Roger Miller and losing to Cameroon. So it's not until the 5-0 against Argentina in 1993 where Colombia finally get, a win on a global stage against one of the biggest teams, that actually their memories are based on a win as opposed to a draw. I think a lot of times in 1957, 1-0 against Uruguay is largely forgotten. That's one of the kind of forgotten great games of Colombia. But because it came on the backdrop of losing 2-8 to Argentina and 9-0 to Brazil, I think that in many ways that kind of particular generation is slightly being erased from national team memory. Certainly you won't find a huge amount of news articles that bring that particular win up. But the 1962 World Cup win is always referenced as being the first great Colombian football triumph.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. You may contact me on my blog and on Facebook under Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on his blog, The 1888 Letter, and on Twitter, he's at 1888 Letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify, on Google and Apple, all under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Please leave a review, rate, and subscribe if you like the podcast. Mr. Watson's contact info and the link to his book are also listed on the blog and podcast listings. So thank you, Peter, and hope to continue these discussions in the future.
Thanks very much, Shad. It's always a pleasure to talk football history with you. Thanks so much for the invitation to come on again.
Thank you.